Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the program, I'm going to have an interview with a representative from Minnesotans for Line 3. They're a citizen-based organization which is supporting the Line 3 replacement project. Line 3 is a pipeline run by Enbridge, which already exists in Minnesota, among other places. And it's being replaced because it's really old and it needs to be replaced. But there's political opposition to it. And this week, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announced that he was going to continue the Dayton and his predecessor, Mark Dayton, his administration's appeal of basically the approval of the pipeline, which at this point seems pretty expressly political. But hold on to the interview section of the podcast. You'll hear all about it. Before we get there, I want to get a couple of rants out of the way. First, some interesting news out of Morton County. Now, Morton County in North Dakota is the county where Mandan is, and Morton County not so long ago was making national headlines because their county was the epicenter for the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and the law enforcement response to those protests was, first and foremost, the Morton County Sheriff's Department. Now, this news today doesn't really have anything to do with those protests, but it does have to do with the name of the Sheriff's Department, and in fact, it's news that's a little bit bigger than just Morton County. Apparently, this is a trend. The Morton County Sheriff's Department doesn't want to be called the Morton County Sheriff's Department anymore. Instead, they want to be called the Morton County Sheriff's Office. So what's the big deal? I mean, what's the difference between the Sheriff's Department and the Sheriff's Office? Well, I guess it is a big deal. It's something that an organization called the National Sheriff's Association. Yes, their acronym is the NSA, but they're not the spy agency that's listening to you make all your phone calls. No, they're the National Sheriff's Association. They sent out a press release, or I should say they put out a document about it, which Morton County then sent out in a press release this week. This is what Maxine Herr, she's a public information officer for Morton County, said in the release. She said, I quote, "I know the terms have been used interchangeably in the past. So I wanted to make you aware in order for you to make the appropriate reference to the office in future reporting." Now, this press release went out to a bunch of reporters and people who wrote about Morton County. I'm on the press release thing because I wrote a lot about the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. Maxine continued in her email, "This is a fairly new movement within our nation's sheriff's offices. We transitioned all of our logos, patches, and badges to office from department just last year, so we are striving to ensure our name is accurately cited wherever it may appear." Now, this is what comes from, this is the reason why, and this is from the National Sheriff's Association. This is why they're making this change, and I promise you I will get in a moment into why this might be kind of an important thing to think about. This is from the National Sheriff's Association explaining the change. They say, I quote, "The Office of Sheriff is not simply another quote-unquote department of county government. The internal operation of an office of sheriff is the sole responsibility of the elected sheriff. County department heads are subordinate to a county governing body because a department is truly only a division of county government. The office of sheriff is a statutory/constitutional office having exclusive powers and authority under state law and/or state constitution. These inherent powers are not subject to the dictates of a local county governing body. The office of sheriff has inherent common law powers and sovereignty granted under a state's constitution and/or state law. It is different from a county department, which derives its limited authority from whatever is delegated to it by statute or by state constitution." So essentially their argument is sheriffs are elected, and so sheriffs have their own authority, and it's not like a county department, which would all come on in North Dakota, would all come under the county commission. So the county, your county government has different departments. I'm sure they have like a road department and different departments to handle different aspects of the county government, and they're all governed by the county board, which delegates its authority to these departments to carry out the business of the county. The argument for calling it a sheriff's office and not a sheriff's department is to differentiate the sheriff's office from one of these subordinate departments. Makes sense so far. But my question to you is, why are we electing sheriffs? I wrote a column about this last year, a print column, questioning whether or not we should be electing sheriffs. And in the column, I noted the number of problems North Dakota has had with sheriffs across the state. There's been a troublesome sheriff in McKenzie County. There's been sheriffs involved in criminal activity. I mean, we've had over the past couple of years, if you find it, and I have this column linked at sayanythingblog.com if you want to look at the details, we've had a lot of problems in sheriff's departments. And that got me to thinking about why we elect sheriffs in the first place. And so, in thinking about it, I started thinking about police chiefs. They're not elected. They serve at the pleasure of municipal leaders. The head of our state patrol here in North Dakota is not elected. That person serves at the pleasure of our governor and is, in fact, a member of the governor's cabinet. He could be hired or fired by, he or she, as the case may be, could be hired or fired by the governor. Our military leaders, and this, I think, is perhaps the most important example. Our military leaders are not elected. They serve at the pleasure of civilian leadership. But we elect sheriff to, and I think by doing so, we afford them a degree of protection from accountability that other law enforcement and military leaders simply don't get, right? I mean, at the national level, our presidents, our generals, we can fire. The president of the United States is ultimately the commander-in-chief, meaning the entire command structure of our nation's armed forces, all branches of them, fall under the authority of the president of the United States. If the president doesn't like a particular general, he could can that general. Now, often Congress has some advise and consent role, but for the most part, the president is the commander-in-chief. And famously, our presidents throughout history have exercised that authority. Harry Truman fired Douglas MacArthur, for instance. Abraham Lincoln fired a number of generals before finally finding his man in Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War. My point is that civilian leadership of our, dare I say, martial branches of government. Now, it makes me a little queasy to lump law enforcement in with the military because they're not the same thing. They shouldn't be thought of as the same thing. But suffice it to say that they're both armed branches of our government, endowed with a lot of power to use things like force and arrest to enforce the peace. So, they're not dissimilar in that regard. And so my idea is, why wouldn't we want sheriffs to also come under direct civilian leadership? Now, I imagine a lot of you are saying, well, Rob, sheriffs are under civilian leadership. They have to be elected by the people. How more civilian does that get? And my argument there is, I tend to think that we already elect too many people, particularly in North Dakota. I mean, if you think about our population, we have a little over 700,000 people living in this state. That makes us a medium-sized city in the shape of a state, right? I mean, our population would make us a medium-sized city in, like, California. But in North Dakota, we're a whole state. We have 2 United States senators, and we have a congressman, and we have a governor, and we have a legislature, and then we have county commissions and city councils and township boards. I mean, we have a lot of government in North Dakota. And you look at all the statewide officials that we elect. We elect an insurance commissioner. We elect a tax commissioner. Now, those offices don't really set any policy. They don't really have any policy-making authority at all. They're basically administrative positions. Their jobs are to execute the policies set forth by the legislature and the executive branch. But other than that, that's really all they do. They don't have any policy-making authority, and yet we elect them. And so I worry how many citizens actually pay attention to sheriff's elections. I mean, how many people are actually tuned in and following on top in a given election, right? During a given election cycle, when voters are already asked with, evaluating different candidates for Congress and different candidates for the legislature and different candidates for county commission and city council, and maybe there's some initiated measures mixed in there too, and they've got to consider all these things, and now they've also got to consider the sheriff's department. And remember also that this is a law enforcement capacity, right? So, the idea is that we're giving a law enforcement officer, we're treating them like an elected official. We almost imbue them, almost give them the idea that they should be making policy, when really they shouldn't. Law enforcement should be taking orders, right? Law enforcement should enforce the law, full stop, right? And the law is written, of course, by our civilian leadership. But law enforcement should follow the law. And so that I understand what Morton County's doing. They want a recognition of the status quo. They are an office, not a department. They are not subordinate to the county commission. But what I would like you listeners to think about is maybe law enforcement should be subordinate to something like a county board. specifically sheriff's departments, or not departments, sheriff's offices. Just something to think about. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we get to our interview is a report from the folks at Campus Reform. Now, this Campus Reform is a conservative leading website, and they do reporting, they do journalism focused on, well, higher education, as you could probably tell from their name, Campus Reform. They generally do a pretty good job. I like most of their posts. They did a story, and it was tied in to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's, Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's controversy around some of her tweets. You've probably heard about this. It's been all over the national news. Controversy over some of her tweets, which I think fairly can be characterized as being pretty anti-Semitic. Now, my intent here is not to delve into that, but rather to talk about Campus Reform's report, where they went and looked at the Congresswoman's alma mater, which is North Dakota State University in Fargo. And they decided to take a look at the donations that were made by members of the administration and faculty at NDSU and what the partisan breakdown was. So that was sort of their impetus for looking at this, was the scandal surrounding Congresswoman Omar. But to me, it's kind of interesting, because what they found is that members of the administration and faculty, now they're not talking about rank and file employees, they're talking about people who are directly in charge of the university, or in charge of, the university's academic mission. So this would be, the professors and the administrators and the deans and the provosts and all these people. During the 2018 election cycle, those folks in NDSU donated $32,153.84 to candidates. Now, there could be more donations than that. Those are just the donations that were above the federal reporting threshold, and thus were reported publicly. Not every donation has to be reported publicly. I think the cutoff's like $200 cumulatively in election cycle. So if you donated less than that, you're not going to show up. But if you donated more than that, you show up. And there were about $32,000 worth of donations to Democratic candidates, exclusively Democratic candidates, during the 2017-2018 election cycle. And I guess that's the part that kind of shocked me. Now, it's not news to you. It's not news to me. It's not really news to anybody that academia leans pretty hard to the left. Doesn't surprise anybody. It does surprise me, though, when we find out that not a single person at least of those who made political contributions above the reporting requirement, of which, we're talking about $32,000 in contributions. So this was more than just a couple people. We are talking about, none of them donated money to a Republican. None of them saw a Republican candidate they thought worth supporting. That surprised me. Not a single one. Like not even 1 out of 10. What? How does that happen? And it reaches a point where I think there's legitimate cause for concern. We talk about diversity on campus a lot, right? We talk about gender diversity and racial diversity, and sexual orientation diversity, and all these different types of diversity, because the idea is that if you have a lot of different life experiences, or a lot of different sorts of people on campus, that leads to a richer academic experience. And on the whole, I agree with that. I'm not sure I agree sometimes with some of the policies we implement to reach that goal, but it's a noble goal just taken at face value. But I wonder why we're not more concerned about ideological diversity, political diversity, right? And I understand that partisan affiliation is not a perfect bellwether for ideology, right? I know Republicans who are pretty liberal, and I know Democrats who are pretty conservative, and it's not perfect, but you would hope in a country that, and especially in a state like North Dakota, where Republicans make up a not insignificant portion of the population, enough where we pretty consistently elect Republicans to Congress, we pretty consistently elect Republicans to the White House. So why aren't some people who think that way, who represent that school of thought, who represent that worldview, why don't we see any of them in academia, either in the administration or the faculty? And if we expect these schools to provide our students with well-rounded educations, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. We want to expose these students to a broad range of ideas and make them more worldly, right? Make them more, dare I say, cosmopolitan, right? I think that's sort of the goal, right? We don't want our kids to be indoctrinated. We want them to be challenged. We want them to be exposed to a lot of different ideas. Only ideologically, politically, it kind of doesn't seem like our higher education institutions are prepared to do that, because by most measures, very, very few, if any at all, of their staff, of their faculty, of their administration are people who are right of center in their political thinking. And it also becomes problematic because universities tackle topics that are complicated, right? I mean, if you're going to teach something like history, if you're going to teach something like sociology, right? I mean, these are intensely complicated topics. These are very, very difficult to swallow. And I wonder if the university is essentially sort of an echo chamber where most of the people there are of one sort of political persuasion, then how can they say that they're doing a good job of presenting these topics to the students? I'm not sure that they can. And that's kind of the problem. I don't know how to solve it. I don't want to have a political litmus test for working at a university, right? I don't want a situation where you have to take a test and we've got to hire a certain quota of Republicans and a certain quota of Libertarians and a certain quota of Green Party members and a certain, well, we seem to be meeting our quota of Democrats. So I don't want to get down to that situation either, but clearly it's something we need to think about. That's it for the rants today. Be sure to stay tuned after the interview for some listener feedback. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. I am here with Mel Olson. Mel has over 2 decades of experience serving as the president of United Piping. As president of the company, he provides leadership to all areas of the business. He is a professional engineer with a civil engineering degree from North Dakota State University. He has led a variety of roles throughout his more than 20 years of industry experience, including engineering, project management, business development, estimating, and executive management. He's also one of the leaders of Minnesotans for Line 3, which is a citizens group formed to support the Line 3 replacement project in Minnesota that has been very controversial for a long time. They're seeing a lot of politics, the same sort of politics around that pipeline project as we saw around the Dakota Access Pipeline project here in North Dakota. That project, of course, now completed, but not without a significant amount of protest and political rigmarole. The Line 3 replacement project, for those of you just catching up on this, a little bit different in that it's not a new pipeline. In fact, it is the replacement of an existing pipeline. Anyway, Mel, thanks for your time. And today had some pretty significant news on this project in that newly elected Governor Tim Walz has come out and said that he will continue an appeal that was started during his predecessor's administration, will consider an appeal and continue to hold up construction of the Line 3 project. React to that a little bit. How are you feeling as a supporter of that project?
We're extremely disappointed. We feel that, it was a typical political bait and switch with the promises made prior to him, gaining office. Governor Walz, along with the special interests, progressive activist groups that he seemed to lend the ear to in the last year and turned down the county commissioners and hearing them out in the week leading up to this decision. I think that those groups, including Governor Walz, who he's clearly put himself in alignment with, they really either don't care about what they claim to care about and protect, which is essentially the environment, and this is 100% political, which I tend to agree that it is. Or in the words of Tom Cruise and A Few Good Men, it's galactically stupid and incompetent and not suitable leadership for the state of Minnesota.
Now, throughout all of this, I think we all support a regulatory process that ensures that these projects are done safely, right? And that we're considering all the different ramifications of a given project, the environmental impact, whether or not there might be, historical or cultural resources along the route, things like that. I mean, those are considered. We want to go through that process. I think every reasonable person wants that process. What bothers me is it seems we've had an endless amount of scrutiny of the Line 3 project, and now we're at a point where I can't help but feel that what's going on now, this is not regulatory scrutiny. This is not an effort to ensure that the pipeline is safe. No, this just looks like politics to me.
I couldn't agree more. The Minnesota Agriculture Energy Alliance just released a statement of their disappointment in Walz's decision as well. The Line 3 review is the most studied project in the state's history. I mean, it was, in their words, very intense and thorough. Multi-year study. Now we're going to do what? Look at the facts again, the same facts, and come up with a different result. That's ludicrous to me. If you want to look at the facts, pipelines are hands down the greenest, most cost-effective, safest ways to move liquids and gases. If you read a recent article in the Star Tribune, the shipment of crude oil by rail through the state of Minnesota doubled in 2018. That article came out on the 9th of February, just prior to this. Trains obviously are at much larger risk, and that's been proven in spades in recent years. Another fact that Line 3 has reached its design life. It was built in the 60s. The technology that we use in new lines to replace it, it's a piece of infrastructure just like a bridge, just like a water line, a sewer line, any other pipeline that carries liquids that has a design life. And Line 3 has reached that. Enbridge is trying to do the responsible thing and replace it by self-funding a $2 billion privately funded infrastructure project that would be an economic boon for the state. And here we have politics as usual.
I think you're exactly right. And again, I mean, you work in this industry, Mel. You're familiar with these projects and what it takes to build them. What I am worried about is that we are getting to a point with these projects where the efficacy of the project itself doesn't matter. The regulatory process exists so that we can build a pipeline. We want to build it safely. We want to build it in a manner that's responsible. But the end result of the process is supposed to be a pipeline. And in this instance, replacing an older pipeline that is, and making it safer, making it transport through. I mean, this is what we want. We want to keep that infrastructure up to date. We want to keep it safe. And what I'm worried about is what this process has turned into is not a process through which we build pipelines, but a process through which we delay them endlessly so that they're not built.
I agree. That's what that's the way that this is headed. And in Governor Walz's statement that he issued, he refers to this new term, a social permit. If a social permit's required, I mean, the rest of us, Enbridge and those trying to build pipelines are following the rules. We followed all the regulatory rules. The PUC has ruled in favor of that we met all of those requirements. If a social permit is required, then you better require it on both sides. I mean, these folks that are going out and doing terroristic activities and turning valves on an active line that are destroying equipment in Carleton, Minnesota, from a pipeline contractor, and were caught, and 2/3 of them are from out of state. This is not this is a state regulatory process, but it's obviously not in-state people that are throwing a monkey wrench in this.
Do you feel like this? I think when Governor Walz does this, when Governor Dayton initiated this process before him, I feel like we're just encouraging those people that you just described. And again, I want to draw a distinction between what I think of as political extremists who just don't want to build pipelines versus people who just have legitimate criticisms or legitimate objections. I mean, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. The process exists to consider, reasonable critiques, reasonable criticism of a given route or a given project or what have you. That's why the process exists. Unfortunately, it's being used by political extremists who are willing to go so far as to commit acts of vandalism and crime to stop pipelines. And when politicians like Governor Walz, they create a situation where they're just going to delay and delay and delay, I feel like they're just encouraging them. You're sending a message to them, telling them, listen, these tactics work, keep it up.
I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what happened today in Walz's decision, and that's given them fuel to their fire. And I couldn't agree with you more.
So what's next? I mean, now I guess the Walz administration is going to continue this appeal process. What happens now?
Well, I mean, that process will again be seen through. I think Governor Walz needs to reevaluate his One Minnesota message that he touted when he was running for office. Apparently, One Minnesota means that if you're from the metro area and a progressive activist, then you're in that One Minnesota. But if you're a business leader or part of Greater Minnesota or part of the rural communities that these pipelines pass through that realize the economic boom from previous years when pipelines went through, I guess you're out and you're not in that One Minnesota.
Well, I guess so. So but as a practical matter, like obviously, I guess the Public Utility Commission is going to take this back. I mean, where do we go from here? I mean, is there a timeline now? I mean, is there a date by which the appeal's over? I mean, is there I guess what I'm trying to ask is there a finish line at some point to all this?
Well, appeals processes, I'm not aware of any, finite timeline for that. I'm hopeful that will be, that time will be of the essence for governor and whoever's, overseeing the appeal process, because time is of the essence.
It's frustrating. I'm gonna say something, and I don't think. Let's admit it. Pipeline companies are not the most sympathetic figures in the world. I realize that, and so I don't know that anybody's gonna go crying in their cereal about the pipeline. But I'm just trying to think how you do business in this sort of a regulatory environment where politics can just create an endless delay, can just create a delay where there's no finish line in sight, where you could get ready for a project, accumulate the capital ready for the for the project, secure the contract, secure the labor force, do all of these things that you need to do for a project like the scope of the Line 3 is, but yet have absolutely no idea when you're going to actually be able to do the work and complete the project. I don't know how you do business in an environment like that.
It's extremely difficult, maybe people don't have a lot of sympathy for pipeline companies, or maybe even the construction companies that rely on that work to survive. But I'm on the people side of it, and I know what it affects. I mean, it affects the employees and the people, and we need to do a better job of getting out there and explaining all the good that we do. I mean, everyone that I work with and work around are extremely proud of their work, and they should be, and of what they build and what they accomplish. And at the end of the day, any company is made up of the people, and that is who are being hurt.
Yeah, well, it's definitely frustrating. Well, Mel, thank you for your time today in talking about this. I think it's just an unfortunate situation, and again, I think we need to reiterate. Nobody minds a process that's orientated around, hey, let's make sure we get this right. Let's make sure we're doing everything safely. I'm fine with that process, but with the Line 3 project, that process ended a long time ago. What's going on now is just politics, and it's frustrating. Mel, anything else to add?
No, thank you for your time, and I just want to reiterate, that there seems to be the situation that only half of this equation is really following the rules, and the other half are not, and currently Minnesota state government is allowing that to happen.
Yeah, for sure. Mel, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
That's it for today's Plain Talk, but before we end the show, some listener feedback. Bill emails about a topic I've been talking about a lot, which is legislation which would change North Dakota's trespass laws. If you haven't been paying attention to this, currently North Dakota law gives the public a presumption of access to rural land unless the landowner posts that land. Now, what the legislation would do is would change that presumption. You would not have a presumption to land, meaning that the landowner would not have to post his land or her land to keep you off of it. Instead, you would have to get permission to get on that land, or the landowner would post it as open. And so far, I think the legislation is proposing an online database through which landowners could do that. I would like to see the legislation to allow posting through physical signs, open to hunt signs, or whatever you want to call them. I would like that as well. Anyway, the listener, Bill, responds to my position on this. He writes, Rob, I agree with you with reference to Senate Bill 2315. It, quote, and here he's quoting me, really doesn't address the fundamental issue of property rights. Bill continues, it's individual rights, and as a landowner, I shouldn't have to go through a lot of government regulations to open my land to hunters. As it is now, while those that wish to reserve their land for themselves or others should continue to have to take the effort to post such land, isn't it strange that some farm organizations that oppose government regulations want government regulations to protect the land from others while capitalizing on government regulations to receive subsidies? You go on to say, quote, this is not public land. It does not belong to the public. Well, you may be right, but in most conditions, the public is paying for it through the government subsidies provided to the landowners' operators. Inasmuch as the land has become so sacred, it may be wise to those with that opinion to prepare now to take it with them when they leave this earth, the short period of time they are here. So, Bill, he starts out saying that he agrees with me. I think he's being a little facetious. I think he clearly disagrees with me. It feels like this is a situation where, he likes the status quo, and he feels it's an onerous, government regulation to require somebody like him who wants to post his land as open to hunters to have to go through that process. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I mean, essentially what we have now is an opt-out system for landowners. If landowners want to protect their land, if they want to keep their land without strangers traipsing across it, they have to opt out of the status quo, meaning that they have to go through the time and expense of posting their land, even if they want to allow hunters on that land, but want a situation where maybe they want the hunters to call first and ask for permission so they can understand who is on their land and when, they still have to go through the time and expense of posting that land. So I don't understand how Bill can see this as an increase in government regulations. He also brings up the subsidies question, and I've heard a lot of people saying this. When you invoke the idea that this is private property, the land belongs to the landowners, and it's not really fair for the public to presume they have access, some people bring up the fact that some of this land is used for agriculture, and a lot of the people who are using it for agriculture take government assistance of one form or another, subsidies or what have you, government subsidized loans maybe, to make their businesses operate. But that's really a separate issue. I mean, you could argue that just about any sort of property gets one level of government subsidy or the other. I mean, government subsidies are so expansive, just about everything you own was either subsidized in its own creation, or perhaps some of its components parts were subsidized, or perhaps the distributors or the retailers or whatever were subsidized in some way. For instance, if you bought a Tesla, let's look at this through another lens. If you bought a Tesla car and you took a government tax deduction, right, because we had that in our federal income tax code, a tax deduction, tax credit, I guess, is a more accurate term for it, for purchasing an electric vehicle. So if you took that tax credit and your electric vehicle got subsidized, does that now suddenly mean that the public has access to your car if you leave your car door open? That you have to lock your doors in order to, or maybe even better, post a sign on your door to keep the public out because the public subsidized the purchase of your car? The public, frankly, subsidized, if you're talking about a Tesla, the public, frankly, subsidized the manufacture of your car as well. I can understand disagreeing with farm subsidy policies. A lot of people do. It's a controversial area of public policy. I get that. I can understand that. But it's a separate issue from the trespass law issue. Well, that's it for today's show. Remember, rate, review the show if you're listening on iTunes, if you're listening on another service that allows ratings and reviews. If you would just post there, honestly, how you feel about the show, that would help us a lot. If you're not subscribing to the show, if you're listening through, by playing this on Twitter or Facebook or listening to it on the blog, consider subscribing. You can use the podcast platform of your choice, whether it's something like Stitcher or Google Podcasts or Pocket Casts. All the links to do that are at sayanythingblog.com. You can find them under the link that says Plain Talk Podcast. Easy as you please. And as always, if you have any feedback you want to for the show, if you're having any troubles listening to the show, any complaints, any praise, or you just want to say hi, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com, or track me down on Twitter, track me down at Facebook. If you just search for Rob Port, I'm pretty easy to find. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.